James Walker had never expected his life to change at a wedding, especially not one on a planet that looked like a diamond floating in space. Thoughts shivered below him like a living crystal as the Earth diplomatic shuttle descended, and as he stared out the window, he couldn't help but feel nervous, because although he was just a mid-level cultural attach aboard the Peregrine's Reach, he had somehow been chosen to represent humanity at the royal wedding of the Thaleri, a newly contacted alien species whose culture was still largely a mystery to Earth. And though he had studied a few customs and learned the basics of their graceful language, nothing had truly prepared him for the beauty and strangeness of the city that welcomed him. Towers of light, walkways that hummed with music, and skies painted with slow-moving beams of color that shifted with the thoughts of the people below. And as he stepped onto the ceremonial landing pad, the warmth of the atmosphere and the gentle bow of the Thaleri envoy made him feel both honored and deeply out of place. Yet the soft smile of the princess, Kira Thalen, who stood beside her towering father, the King Verhal, surprised him the most, because she looked straight at him as if she already knew something he didn't, and when he bowed awkwardly in return, she laughed gently, a musical sound that echoed strangely in the air around them. And later, at the grand banquet, where the food shimmered and floated slightly above the plates, James tried to blend in with the other guests, all tall and glittering aliens in long robes of living fabric. But the moment came when a cup was placed in his hand. The host beside him, a noble of some kind, raised their own and said something in ceremonial Thaleri. Nodding at James to follow suit, and wanting to be polite, he lifted his cup and repeated the words with careful pronunciation. And then, as he drank, the room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him, which made his stomach twist as the king rose from his seat, looked at his daughter, then at James, and declared in a voice both proud and final, "It is done. The bond is accepted." And James, frozen in place, heart hammering in his chest, realized with growing horror that he had no idea what he just agreed to. While Princess Kira, with a mysterious expression, walked toward him and said, "You honor me, James Walker of Earth," and took his hand gently in hers. And even though her touch was warm and calm, his mind was racing, because every instinct told him something important had just happened, something irreversible. And when the Earth ambassador rushed to his side moments later, whispering frantically about ancient binding customs and ceremonial phrases, James began to understand that this wasn't just a toast, it was a proposal, a cultural ritual of commitment, and somehow, by repeating those words and sharing that drink, he had triggered a marriage bond recognized by Thaleri law. And now, as he stood there in front of 100 alien nobles, holding hands with a royal princess, he could feel the eyes of the court, the pressure of his own people watching from afar, and the impossible weight of what came next, because if he rejected the bond, he could insult the king and ruin Earth-Thaleri relations, and if he accepted, well, he was going to have to marry a princess from a world he barely understood. James Walker stood frozen in the grand hall of the Thaleri Palace, still holding Princess Kira's hand, as whispers rippled through the glowing crowd, and the king's words echoed in his ears. The bond is accepted, and though the princess looked calm and even amused, James felt like the ground beneath him had tilted, and the room around him now seemed brighter, sharper, and strangely more distant, because he did not understand how one polite toast had suddenly become a life-changing event. And, as the princess gently led him away from the center of the hall to a quieter chamber filled with soft blue light and floating cushions, James struggled to keep his expression neutral while his thoughts ran wild, wondering how a single phrase could carry so much weight in a culture he barely understood. When the doors closed behind them and silence fell, Kira turned to him with a smile that was both kind and curious and said, "You are very bold for a human," to which James responded with a nervous laugh and a confused, "What just happened?" And Kira tilted her head slightly, her shimmering hair catching the light like water. Dan replied, "You offered the bonding toast in the ancient tongue before the royal court, in the presence of the king and the stars above, and I accepted, as is our custom." And James blinked rapidly, shaking his head, saying he hadn't meant to offer anything, that he was only repeating what he thought was a polite phrase, not a proposal. And as she listened patiently, she nodded slowly and said, "Your sincerity is clear, but the ritual is not bound by intent, it's bound by act. And your act was witnessed." And just then, the doors opened again, and a tall, stern-looking Deliri in dark ceremonial armor entered and introduced himself as Master Alvec, keeper of the bonds, who explained that, by Theleri law, James had formally entered the first stage of union with the royal house, a stage that could only be withdrawn through the trial of sincerity, a public test of intention and truth. And James, his throat dry, asked what happened if he simply said no, walked away, refused it all, and Alvic's expression darkened slightly as he replied, "Then the bond is broken with dishonor, and it will be seen as a grave insult to the king, to the princess, and to the future of the Larry human relations." And James felt the weight of 1,000 diplomatic eyes on him, his mind racing through the possible fallout, thinking of headlines, protests, political chaos, if Earth was blamed for offending the Deliri at their most sacred event. And before he could speak again, the captain of the Peregrines' Reach ambassador, Leanne, rushed in, her calm usually unshakable, but now clearly strained. She pulled James aside and whispered that this situation, while a mess, be a turning point in peaceful relations, that if he handled it with care, it could raise his status in humanity's image across the sector. And James, half panicked and half fascinated, muttered that he didn't come to become a royal anything. He just liked alien food and being polite. But Ambassador Leanne urged him to take the trial of sincerity, not as a promise to marry, but as a respectful way to clarify his intentions without disgrace. And James, seeing no better way out, reluctantly agreed, asking what the trial involved. And Master Alvec explained that it would consist of 3 challenges: memory, music, and the vision. Dan Sandich would reveal the truth of his heart, not just to the court, Kira herself. And failure wouldn't mean death or prison, but it would bring shame, a permanent mark on his diplomatic record, and perhaps even exile from Theleri space. And James sighed deeply, wondering how his quiet career in Xeno relations had spiraled into this. And as the next day dawned, with twin suns casting pale gold and violet shadows across the palace walls, James was guided to the chamber of reflection for the first challenge, where he was told to sit before a memory mirror that would project his most honest emotion from the past 24 hours onto a crystal screen. And as he focused, heart pounding, the mirror shimmered and displayed not fear or confusion, but a strange, quiet curiosity, a flash of that moment when Kira had smiled at him. And he'd wondered what it meant, and the watching nobles nodded with interest, because curiosity was a respected trait among the Deliri, and it suggested that James might not have come here by accident, at least not entirely. And after a brief rest, he was led to the Hall of Harmony for the second trial, where he was asked to express emotion through sound. And while the Deliri used vibrating stones and voice harmonizers to create complex emotional songs, James simply pulled out a small harmonica he carried as a hobby. And though he'd never played for anyone but himself, he closed his eyes and played a slow, uncertain tune from his childhood, something gentle and human, and the sound was raw and simple compared to the rich tones of the Larry instruments. But it was honest, and the room listened in silence, and when he stopped, a low hum of approval rose from the court, because truth, no matter how humble, was valued here more than perfection. And finally, James was led to the Star Garden, a dome filled with floating lights and drifting petals. Where the last trial of the vision dance would occur, and Kira joined him, wearing a cloak of shifting light, her expression unreadable. And together they stepped onto the platform where psychic patterns would emerge from their shared thoughts, creating moving shapes in the air around them. And as they began, James let his mind relax, focusing not on fear, but on understanding. On Kira's calm presence, on her laughter from the banquet, on the strange beauty of this world. And slowly, the air filled with soft spirals of light, patterns of growing vines, stars orbiting hands, and bridges connecting to different skies. And the court gasped, because these were rare symbols of unity and open minds. And even Kira looked surprised. And when the dance ended, silence held the garden like breath, until the king stepped forward and said, "The trials are complete." And the court waited, and James, standing beside Kira, asked in a clear voice what happened now. And Master Alvec declared that he had passed not with splendor, but with sincerity, and the bond was now his too. Accept or respectfully decline. And James, turning to look at Kira, saw her watching him, not as a princess, but as a person, curious and open. And for the first time since the banquet, he no longer felt like a pawn in a mistake, but a guest on the edge of something strange and possibly wonderful. James Walker stood quietly in the center of the Hall of Sincerity, where the light did not come from lamps or windows, but from the smooth, glowing walls themselves, pulsing with slow rhythm like a heartbeat. And though he had already faced the first two parts of the trial, his memories and his music, he now stood before the final test, the one that many called the most difficult, because it could not be studied, prepared for, or hidden from. And as he looked around at the gathered nobles, their tall forms wrapped in shimmering robes, he felt again the weight of every step he had taken since accepting the challenge, wondering if he had made the right choice by not backing out when he had the chance, because it was not just his own future at stake anymore, but Earth's connection with Dalzir, the reputation of the humans who would come after him, and something else too. Something he had not expected: his growing respect for Princess Kira, who stood now beside him in silence, her eyes calm but watchful, her presence both reassuring and mysterious. And as the vision dance began, a soft hum filled the chamber, and the floor beneath their feet lit up with ancient symbols, shifting and glowing in response to their emotions. And James was told to clear his thoughts, to let his true feelings rise without trying to shape or hide them, because the lights would reveal all fear, anger, hope, confusion. Serend, though he was nervous, James closed his eyes and remembered the last few days, the moment of the mistaken toast, the shock in the banquet hall, the whispers, the panic, and the calm of Kira's voice, the quiet strength in her gaze, and the strange comfort he had felt despite everything. And slowly, the lights began to change, forming a pattern in the air above them, soft arcs of blue and silver, looping like vines in a breeze, then merging into rings that pulsed gently. And the Thalari nobles began to whisper again, not in fear, but in wonder, because those were signs of openness, of connection, not just formality or obligation. And James opened his eyes to find Kira looking at him, not with judgment, but with something deeper, something like understanding. And then the lights flickered, shifted, and showed a new pattern, a bridge between two glowing suns, one red and one blue, and a path of tiny stars linking them. And this time the whispers stopped altogether, because the bridge symbol had not appeared in a vision dance in many years, and its meaning was clear even to James, who had studied enough Thalari art to know it represented unity across worlds. And as he watched the vision dissolve into light, Master Elvic stepped forward and announced that the trial had ended, and the court waited for the final judgment, which could not come from the king or the nobles, but only from Kira and James themselves. And James turned to the princess, his voice steady but quiet, and said, He had not come here to deceive or manipulate, but that something about her world and about her made him want to understand more. And Kira smiled and replied that sincerity, once revealed, should never be wasted. And with a simple gesture, she placed her hand over his heart, sealing the success of the trial, and a soft chime rang through the air, followed by a rising chorus of Valyrian music from unseen instruments, signaling that the bond had been upheld, not forced, and could now move forward with respect. And James, still trying to believe all this was real, followed Kira back to the royal chambers for a private audience with the king, who was pleased but also wary, explaining that many in the court would not easily accept a human consort, that challenges would still come. And James said he understood that trust was not given in full with one event, but earned over time. And just as the moment seemed to settle, a royal attendant entered with a quiet voice and pale face, whispering something to the king, whose expression changed at once from calm to concerned. And he stood slowly, then told James and Kira that a threat had been discovered, encrypted message intercepted by palace security, hinting at an attempt to sabotage the bond and disgrace the royal family before the full wedding could take place. And though the message was traced to a minor noble house that had ties to a rival empire, it was unclear how far the plot had spread. And the king, with deep seriousness, asked James if he was ready to remain in Thalsir for the coming weeks, not just as a guest, but as a visible partner in the next ceremonies, because his continued presence would either strengthen the new alliance or give the enemies of peace an excuse to call the bond a mistake. And James, though still overwhelmed by the pace of everything, nodded and said yes, not out of pressure, but because he had come to believe that what had started as an accident might be something more. And as the court prepared for the next steps, eyes, both friendly and hostile now, followed him wherever he went. And while Kira helped him learn more about her world's customs, James quietly studied the people around him, trying to spot signs of deception or danger, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination, because deep inside, he had no desire to run anymore. Not just for duty, but because something inside him had begun to change. Something that told him that maybe, just maybe, this alien world and its strange, shining people were no longer so strange to him, and that his place in this unfolding story was not a mistake, but the start of something greater than he had ever imagined. James Walker had only just begun to feel slightly comfortable in the glittering halls of thought, Zir's royal palace, when the weight of suspicion began to settle on his shoulders like a quiet storm. Because, after the trial of sincerity had ended, in a surprising and sincere success, the whispers did not fade, they only changed, growing softer, colder, and more dangerous, as if the smiling faces and elegant greetings were now masks hiding something deeper beneath. And James, though still learning the subtle signs of the Larry expressions, began to notice when conversations stopped as he entered rooms, when certain nobles narrowed their eyes or stepped away from him with the graceful coldness only Thalari nobility could master. And it was Princess Kira who first confirmed his fears, bringing him into her private chamber late one evening after another long day of public appearances and learning ancient customs. And she spoke with a voice low and careful, saying that 3 noble families, House Veldrin, House Selver, and House Ither, had all recently sent cryptic messages to the palace, questioning the legality of the bond, and worse, hinting that if it moved forward, they would withdraw support from future diplomatic talks between their sectors and the royal court. And James, feeling the pressure mount, asked why they would go so far. Kira explained that the Larry politics were like rivers beneath a still lacum on the surface, but powerful and shifting underneath them, that, for generations, certain families had hoped to join with the royal line through marriage to secure their own influence. At the sudden appearance of a human outsider who had accidentally fulfilled the ancient bonding rite, had broken their careful plans, and some believed the only way to restore balance was to unravel the bond completely, even if it meant scandal or sabotage. And James, more determined than frightened now, said he would not step away just to protect old ambitions. And Kira looked at him with approval, but also worry, because the days ahead would test not just their words, but their loyalty and courage. And the next morning, as preparations continued for the second phase of the bonding ceremony, a sacred walk through the grove of stars, where the couple was meant to declare their union before the living trees, then recorded royal history, James was handed a scroll with no signature, sealed in black wax, which he unrolled alone in his quarters, and found a simple message inside that read, "Turn back before the grove, or the stars will weep for you." Up. And though it was only a few words, the threat felt sharp and direct, and James reported it to the royal guards, but no clear source was found. In that evening, as he walked with Kira through the luminous halls toward the ceremonial gardens, a loud crash echoed from behind a nearby wall, followed by the sound of running feet, and when guards arrived, they discovered a shattered vial of poison hidden inside a gift box meant for the couple, and the box bore the crest of House Silver. Though that alone could not prove guilt, and tension tightened like a wire across the palace. And the king summoned his council to discuss next steps, but asked James to remain visible, to continue his lessons, his public visits, his presence at court dinners, because showing fear would only feed the rising unrest. And so James did just that, even as he noticed the servants whispering more, even as strange symbols appeared etched in the corners of his room's windows. Symbols, Kira later told him, were warnings used in ancient court feuds. And still, he stayed, learning the local history, asking questions, meeting with minor nobles, and controlled visits to show goodwill. And soon, he met someone unexpected, Terrell, quiet archivist who worked in the palace library, who claimed to know secrets about the bond rights that even the king's advisors had forgotten. And James, sensing something honest in the man's gentle tone, agreed to meet him again in secret, and under cover of night, Taro revealed a faded book that told of a lost fourth trial, once used in the earliest royal bonds, a right of mirrored choice, where each partner faced a question without knowing the other's answer, and only if both chose unity would the bond be made eternal in the eyes of the living stars. And though it was no longer required by law, Tyrell whispered that performing it in public might prove their commitment in a way no noble could deny or twist. And James brought this idea to Kira, who, after a long silence, agreed but warned that once begun, the ritual could not be paused or reversed, and that its results would be seen by all who watched. And James, believing that truth was the only way forward now, gave his word to try it, and preparations began for the secret rite to be made public once again. And word spread fast, too fast, as if someone had known all along what they planned. And days before the ceremony, another message came, this one written in ancient script and much longer, warning that if the mirrored choice went forward, blood would be spilled before vows were spoken. And the king, furious and concerned, doubled the guards, while Kira told James that our old tutor, a wise but bitter man, once aligned with House Veldrin, had vanished 2 nights earlier and might be behind the threats. And so the day of the ritual arrived under thick clouds, with the usually golden skies dim and heavy, and James stood before the grove of stars. The trees, tall and glowing, their bark moving gently with the breath of ancient knowledge, while nobles, guards, and even distant diplomats gathered silently in a wide circle. And Kira stood opposite him, her robes woven with starlight thread. And as the keeper of the grove spoke the old words, each of them was led into a separate chamber of reflection, where a single question was asked: will you choose unity, knowing the cost? And neither knew the other's answer, but each responded with truth. And when they returned to the circle, The keeper touched both their hands with a beam of starlight, and the grove reacted. Each trees shimmering, leaves glowing silver and blue, meaning both had chosen the same answer. And the court gasped, many in awe, a few in visible anger. And just then, a sudden cry rang out as a figure in dark robes leaped from the crowd, a blade in hand, charging straight toward Kira. But James stepped in front of her before the guards could react, and the blade struck his shoulder, sending him to the ground. And chaos erupted as the attacker was subdued, revealed to be the missing tutor, his mind filled with fury and old oaths broken. And as James lay wounded but awake, Kira knelt beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. And the king stepped forward and declared, in front of all, that any further threats would be treated as treason. That James had proven not only sincerity, but loyalty with his life, and that the bond would move forward in full honor. And as James was helped to his feet, the crowd stood in silence, then slowly began to bow one by one, even the most doubtful nobles lowering their heads. And for the first time, James felt not like an outsider or an accident, but like someone who had earned his place, not through tradition, but through truth. And though the days ahead would still hold challenge, he now walked beside Kira, not as a guest or symbol, but as a chosen partner in both name and spirit. James Walker recovered faster than the palace healers expected, though the wound on his shoulder still ached during cold mornings. But he refused to rest long, knowing that something had shifted the moment the blade struck and the grove of stars chose to answer. Because while the ritual had brought honor to his bond with Princess Kira and quieted many of the old noble families, it had also caught the attention of forces far beyond the Alzir as court's forces, who had watched Earth from afar with interest, caution, and, now, growing concern. And within days of the ceremony, 3 off-world delegations requested immediate meetings, claiming they wished to discuss new diplomatic ties. But the timing was too perfect, too fast. And it was Kira who warned James that Thalzir's sudden unity with a human might be seen as a threat by older empires who preferred things to remain divided, predictable, and under their quiet influence. And sure enough, when the first envoy from the Lathri Dominion arrived, the message they delivered was polite, but Sharp Earth was not ready. They said, not politically mature, not properly trained for high diplomacy, and its people, though clever and emotional, were still too chaotic to join galactic partnerships. And James sat in the palace chamber as their cold words echoed, but instead of replying with anger, he requested a single hour to speak not as royalty, but as a representative of Earth itself, and the king granted it, warning him that mistakes here could weaken more than just pride. And when the hour came, James stepped into the central hall, dressed not in robes of light, but in a simple Earth-style suit, clean and formal. And he began by showing the history of Earth's struggles, not hiding the wars or mistakes, but highlighting the resilience, the growth after hardship, the way humans learned by failing and rising again. And then he told the story of how he arrived at the alien wedding by accident, how he made cultural mistakes, how he was almost sent away, and how, instead of quitting, he stayed, listened, learned, and protected someone who was once a stranger. Now his bond may tend that this, not perfection, was what made humanity strong. Their will to adapt, connect, and protect, even in strange and distant places. And when he finished, there was silence, long and heavy. And finally, the Lathri envoy nodded slowly and said they would observe further, which was the closest to approval James could hope for. And Kira smiled at him later and said no Thaliri could have spoken so boldly without sounding arrogant. And James only laughed and said humans were built for chaos. And soon after, Earth's ambassador finally arrived, Ambassador De Leon, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, who had followed the news from orbit and now met James with both relief and a long list of things to discuss, because Earth's council had realized the bond was no longer just a personal link, it was now a political bridge. Bridges must be protected, and while James was still learning the rules of this alien world, he knew that Earth could not step up with only words. So he worked with Kira and DeLeon to create something new, a shared project between Earth and Thalseer, something that could show real cooperation, not just ceremony. And the answer came from the stars themselves. An ancient Thalari station, long abandoned in deep orbit, once a center for science and peacekeeping, now forgotten and falling apart. But if restored, it could become the first joint outpost between human and Thalari people. And soon, engineers from both worlds began arriving. Teams worked day and night in shifts, learning each other's tools, translating ancient code, and building new systems together. And James visited often, offering coffee to tired workers, giving speeches, listening to frustrations, and gradually earning the respect, not just of nobles, but of laborers, mechanics, and young minds who believed the future could be different. But while hope rose, danger never slept, and strange events began happening around the station. Power failures with no known source, data losses, and once a guidance drone sent spiraling into open space by false commands. And James, remembering the threats from before, suggested a deeper scan, and sure enough, hidden deep within the station's core, they found a small but advanced device, a cloaked transmitter, feeding false data to an unknown receiver. And suspicion flared again, not just at the saboteur's origin, but at the message itself, which seemed designed to cause quiet failure, to break trust slowly instead of in one loud blow. And the investigation was quiet, slow, careful, and after days of questioning, they discovered it had been placed by a disguised tech from House Ethar, who had slipped into the crew under a false name, hoping to make the project look like a failure so their political wing could later argue against the Human-Thalari alliance. And when this was revealed, even the quiet nobles began to shift their stance, some moving from doubt to cautious support, and the king declared that the outpost would be completed as a symbol of unity, no matter who tried to stand in the way. And James, still bruised and not yet finished with challenges, gave a speech at the dedication, broadcast across both planets, in which he said, "Humanity did not come here to conquer or to beg. We came here by mistake, but we stayed by choice. We make mistakes, we grow, and we stand with those who believe in something better." In the crowd, a mix of humans and Thalari rose and applauded. And in that moment, even James knew this was no longer just his strange story, but the first page of something new and far away on Earth. Children now studied the tale of the accidental bond and how one man stepped up, not just for love, but for the future of two worlds. The wind across the high towers of Thalseer's capital felt different now, cooler, calmer, yet humming with tension like the quiet before a great storm. As James Walker stood on the balcony beside Princess Kira, now his official partner in both name and standing, watching the stars above blink into place one by one, because tonight, after weeks of repairs, threats, speeches, and diplomacy, the great summit between Earth and the Thalari would begin, not as a test or negotiation, but as the formation of a new alliance, one that could either shape the galaxy for good or collapse under pressure from old enemies and hidden fears. And though James had never planned to be part of history, a tour, whatever force ruled ancient alien weddings, had chosen him anyway. And now the galaxy was watching closely, waiting to see if this human, who once tripped on his own feet at a royal ceremony, could stand tall among stars and empires. And he felt that pressure as the first ships arrived, sleek Earth diplomatic vessels escorted by the Thalari honor guards, followed by observers from the Lethari Dominion, neutral traders from Veltarn, even a surprise guest from the deep cold Vari clans, all curious about this human who had accidentally become bonded to royalty and now acted as a symbol for something larger than politics. And while some came in peace, others came with eyes like blades, waiting for weakness, and Kira sensed it too, warning James that although peace was the goal, not all were ready to let go of the old ways. And soon, during the opening session of the summit held beneath the glass dome of the Star Forum, that warning proved true, because as James delivered his welcome speech short, heartfelt, and focused on building trust across Kolchuza, a sudden flash of light burst through the room's edge, followed by a pulse of sound that shook the glass, and chaos broke out as guards rushed forward. But there was no explosion, no damage. It's just a bright mark etched into the floor in ancient script, glowing with red energy, a warning from an unknown faction claiming the alliance would break the balance and bring ruin to both planets. And the summit was paused, the guests shaken, and even Earth's ambassador, DeLeon, looked more tense than usual. Her voice low as she told James this was the kind of fear that old powers used to keep new ones from rising, and that, unless they responded fast and united, the summit might fail before it truly began. And James, tired but not afraid, asked for time to speak, again not with speeches, but with action, and, working through the night, he coordinated bold move, a shared mission between Thaleri and human volunteers to a nearby moon, where rumors of a hidden outpost possibly connected to the Red Mark saboteurs had been quietly circulating for years, and within 2 days, a stealth ship departed in secret, carrying James, Kira, to human engineers, Kay, and a Thaleri scout team to the icy surface of Celtra. And what they found, they're shocked. The Malin, ancient war station, half buried in ice, its power core still pulsing faintly, and inside, evidence of a third-party interference data logs showing messages sent to both human and Thaleri extremists trying to stir chaos and distrust by posing as each side, faking threats, planting doubts, all part of a larger plan to keep the two species divided. And James, staring at the cracked control panel, realized this was no random sabotage, it was strategy. And someone very old and very clever had been working for years to keep peace from ever blooming. And they returned with proof. And when James stood once more in the Star Forum, showing images and decrypted messages, the room went silent, because it was clear now that the attack hadn't come from either Earth or Thalzir, but from a forgotten network of agents who profited from fear. And the room slowly turned toward unity. Nobles and officers nodding, diplomats leaning closer, and the king, rising from his place, declared that the bond between Earth and Thalzir would be protected not just by ceremony, by shared purpose, and that the first true act of this alliance would be to hunt down and dismantle these shadow networks. And when the summit ended, days later, the final document, the Accord of Twin Stars, was signed by both worlds, witnessed by old allies and new skeptics, marking the start of something no one had imagined when James first stepped off his shuttle into the wrong wedding hall. And as celebrations began, as music filled the air and ships flew overhead in bright formation, James stood once more beside Kira, her hand in his, both of them watching a future that had once seemed impossible unfold in real time. And though he was still a human far from home, he now belonged not just to Earth, but to something greater, a new alliance, born not from power, but from persistence, honesty, and a strange, stubborn hope of one man who had simply tried to do the right thing in a galaxy full of wrong turns.